Welcome. This is the Free Market Roadshow, probably the largest annual series of public conferences on economics. Remarkable experts are discussing the challenges and providing libertarian solutions to today's problems. Organized by the Austrian Economic Center in cooperation with select institutes, universities and think tanks, the Free Market Roadshow tours all over Europe. Today we pay a visit to Belgrade.
The University of Belgrade is one of the oldest universities in southeastern Europe, founded in 1808. Today, it is also one of the few largest universities on the continent, with more than 100,000 students and 4,000 professors, organized in 31 schools and 12 research institutes. Faculty of Economics and Business was founded in 1937. Today, it is a modern school with a long tradition, aiming to provide cutting-edge knowledge, skills and research in economics, business management and statistics. With more than 50,000 alumni and more than 8,000 active students, over 120 faculty and researchers, it is one of the leading higher education institutions in economics, business and statistics in southeastern Europe.
The University of Belgrade Faculty of Law is one of the top law schools in the region of southeastern Europe and possesses a record of academic excellence and international scholarly influence. Combining its traditional values with the needs of the modern era, as well as the demanding standards of the European higher education area, the Faculty of Law has continued to strengthen its integrity, reputation, competitiveness, and development capacities.
Good evening, good afternoon, in fact. You have seen that we are now in Belgrade, and I'm personally very happy to take part once again in our annual Free Market Roadshow, the biggest event. And as we said, we are among 4,000 professors, and we are now addressing you from the Faculty of Law, in fact, who is giving us technical facilities, and also thanks to Mrs. Alexandra Jovanovic, professor of the Faculty of Law, also a long-standing member of our group who is supporting free market initiatives. Tonight we have a very exciting moment, I think, to discuss the ideas, the protection of intellectual property rights, and more specific topics. Why it is very important at the moment? Because I think that we are all aware of the problems of transition to the group of countries who are characterized by the, let's say, innovation-driven economies, not only factor-driven or efficiency-driven. For the area from where we are talking, and it's Southern Eastern Europe and Western Balkans, the problem has also its special moment. That is that according to the International Property Rights Index, the worst, let's say, marks and the worst performance is in the field of the protection of the intellectual property rights. Much lower marks are for that area than for, let's say, physical protection of property. So it has its a big reason that we have proposed this topic. In the theoretical field, I should say that the attention of the academic society and scholarly article has been raised after the Nobel Prize for Economics given to Professor Paul Romer in 2018 for his Economics of Ideas. Economics of ideas and the role of ideas as non-rival and partly excludable goods in economic development has a special role. Now, let me say about our program. Our keynote speaker is Mr. Henrique Schneider from Switzerland. He is serving as he is head of economic policy within the Swiss Association, actually Federation of Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. He is also a lecturer at Nord Academy in Elmshorn in Germany. And Professor Henrique Schneider has submitted a very exciting approach to the topic. And personally, I enjoyed it very much. And I think you should also enjoy starting with fire, knives, and ideas. And you don't know what is more dangerous, in fact. But Professor is starting also with some statistics that more new ideas and patents are in the field of gaming and video games than in the field of producing drugs and pharmaceuticals. So after this very dark start, Professor Schneider is giving us some light at the end of the tunnel. And when you see from his career that he is publishing a number of books, I found out that maybe this small light at the end comes from his idea and interest for creative destruction and sharing economy. And this is the title of his recent books. So I would not be longer. I think the topic is enough exciting, and we shall give floor to our discussants and panelists. And let me now welcome Mr. Henrique Schneider and thank him that he has accepted to be our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Intellectual property, fire, and other dangerous things. Whenever talking about intellectual property, IP, to a group of libertarians, classic liberals, Austrian objectivists, you are always playing with fire. And there is no ruling out that even more dangerous things might occur, since this is one of the fields where we really don't agree, and agreement is difficult to find. Hi, I'm Henrique Schneider. I am the chief economist of the Swiss Federation of Small and Medium Enterprises. And in this 15 minutes I have with you, I'm going to talk a little bit about intellectual property, and if there is a middle ground way of dealing with it. Let me start, though, by asking you one question. Why is there more money being invested in the development of video games than in research of new drugs and medicine? Every year, almost 200 billion US dollars are invested in the development of new video games. At the same time, empirical research claims that the innovation rate of medical research is dropping. And here comes the interesting thing. Video games have much more lax intellectual property protection than drugs have. Famously, or infamously, depending on where you stand on this issue, the development of drugs and medical research has one of the most stringent IP regimes on the planet. Video games have not. How is it that the one without the video game is innovating and getting ever more money, and the one with the IP, the medicine, is getting lost in or losing the innovation track? Now, of course, it would be unfair and analytically imprecise to say it's because of the IP, but it's nonetheless noteworthy that there is this big difference and that IP plays a role in it. We're going to return to this topic at the end of this short talk. Let me first go one step back. How do or did libertarian, classic liberals, Austrians, and objectivists think about intellectual property rights? We are split in different camps. Some of them don't want IP. Some think that IP is a wrong approach. For example, these two gentlemen over here. The one on the right, the IP man, is Stephen Kinsella. Kinsella is an economist and lawyer. He researches for himself, but also in the American Mises Institute. And he claims that IP are a fundamental analytical mistake. And more than that, that they, IP, infringes on real property rights. One example is, imagine that I, Henry, copyright or patent the concept of the house. I claim it's mine. I exclude you from using the concept house. Therefore, you will not be able to build your house. And by me doing so, I am infringing on your own and proper property right. So he thinks that this is actually an anti-libertarian, an anti-economic, and anti-property principle. The gentleman on the left is Roderick Long. Roderick Long claims that IP is unnecessary, and he claims that on an empirical ground only. He reviews a lot of cases and finds out these cases have nothing to do with IP. I have here a factual text from one of his most important articles against IP. Is it credible, so goes Long, is it credible that authors will not be motivated to write unless they are given copyright protection? Long says, not very. Consider the hundreds of thousands of articles uploaded onto the internet by the authors every day, available to anyone in the world for free. Is it credible that publishers will not bother to publish uncopyrighted works for fear that a rival publisher will break in and ruin their monopoly? Long answers again, not very. Nearly all works written before 1900 are in the public domain. Yet, pre-1900 works are still published and still sell well. Long continues, is it credible that authors in a world without copyrights will be deprived of remuneration for their work? Again, says Long, not likely. In the 19th century, British authors have no copyright protection under American law, yet they received royalties from American publishers nonetheless. So what's the deal with IP rights according to Long? IP rights, they have no economic implication. They are just surplus rents squeezed out by rent seekers, not entrepreneurs, who want the government to grant them a monopoly. Empirically, IP does not lead to more innovation. Empirically, it only leads to rent-seeking behavior, claims Long. Well, there are some economists, scholars in this libertarian at large camp who favor IP. Think of this lady known as Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, the founder of objectivism, was big on IP. She thought it to be a part of the commercial society. Here too, I have a quote, but I'm only going to read the boldened parts. She says in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, patents and copyrights are legal implementation of the base of all property rights, a man's right to the product of his mind. And then the other quote, at the other end, what the patent and copyright laws acknowledge is the paramount role of mental effort in the production of material values. These laws protect the mind's contribution in its purest form, the origination of an idea. Ayn Rand. Now, Some among you listeners will say, well, yeah, if she was an objectivist, she's not one of our camp, she's not an Austrian. Okay, not an Austrian. The Austrians among you will recognize the gentleman on the right, Ludwig von Mises. I don't think it's possible to be much more Austrian than Ludwig von Mises. In human action, as many Austrians will acknowledge, the stepstone of his work, in human action, Mises makes a claim in favor of IP. He says, without IP, it is unlikely that people would undertake the laborious task of writing such things as textbooks, manuals, handbooks, and other non-fictional work. He also says, in human action, Mises, the Austrian among Austrians, that it is very probable that technological progress would seriously be retarded without intellectual property. Mises. And now maybe some of you will say, yeah, but Mises was an Austrian, but a bourgeois. He was in his time. If you have anyone thinking more liberally about the world, aka an anarchist, then you will certainly have someone speaking against IP. Maybe, but even anarchists spoke in favor of IP. This gentleman on the left with the big beard is Lysander Spooner. Lysander Spooner is the father of anarchism in the US. The guy was an anarchist, not some objectivist, classic liberal Austrians and other relatively bourgeois position. The guy was the anarchist. And what does he say? Verbatim from the law of intellectual property, he claims, so absolute is an author's right of dominion over his ideas that he may forbid it being communicated even by human voice if he so pleases. Absolute intellectual property right. And I mean, this is an anarchist claiming this. This is a one that does not like the state at all and still thinks that there is an absolute intellectual property right. So as you see, the camp is split, but there is middle ground. There is middle ground. And it might astonish you to see this gentleman on the left portrayed here as a middle grounder. This is a young photo of Murray Rothbard, the guy on the left. Murray Rothbard can be understood in some form as a middle grounder between these two camps, the one completely opposing and the one in favor of IP. Why? Murray Rothbard understood that there is a role for intellectual property right. Yes, he did not like an absolute protection, and yes, he was against a state protection. But in several works, he ruminated the idea that there could be a weak form of intellectual property right negotiated by private agents so that you can put it in a contract between private agents and that this contract would, to some degree, restrain the ability of the other to further use your idea. For those of you who know Rothbard, Rothbard was very adamant on some ideas, but in other ideas, he left it a little bit uncompleted. And this was one of those ideas he left uncompleted. Some of his followers thought about, yeah, you could, for example, come up with some insurance product for your copyright. You could put this copyright in a database and just a publication would make it clear that it is your idea. So there is a communitarian way of taking care of your intellectual property. But all these models have been underexplored. And now comes the two gentlemen on the right. They are not libertarians. Well, I don't know if they are libertarians or not. They are not even economists. They are not very ideologically pursued people. The, these two gentlemen are Marshall van Alstyne and Geoff Parker, and they research platforms, online digital platforms. And they research that stuff. They have no stake in the game. What they did find out is, surprisingly, that on digital platforms, there is a private negotiation of intellectual property. The idea of a platform, or let's take the platform ecosystem, is to have a lot of participants, participants that develop things together. In order to develop things together, they need some kind of access to each other's technologies, for example, in form of interfaces. They also need access into each other ideas and business processes and so on. And they found out that in this private ecosystem world, digital ecosystem world, there is IP negotiation that at the same time keeps, in some conservative sense, some intellectual property, but at the same time makes the participants want to share it with the others. And this is not by design, but only by outcome of the platform experience, because in the platform, the more participate and the more integrate, the more value everyone will have. So actually, they found out that this vaguely exposed system of private enforcement of some kind of IP, while also privately making some pressure on sharing stuff, is feasible in a digital world. Of course, Murray Rothbard did not think of the digital world. And of course, Van Alstyne and Parker did not quote Rothbard. That is not the point. The point is that in a conservative way, meaning in a very reduced form of what intellectual property might be, there is room for private contractualism. And this we know from empirical experience. We know that it exists out there because these two guys, Van Alstyne and Parker, found it out. They did not invent it. They saw that platforms are doing it already. They are preserving a reduced sense of IP while making the IP holder share much more than they would be willing to if they had absolute protection. And this is what I consider to be interesting, not only academically, but also practically, because if you look at the world today, IP is a mess. IP goes with a lot of bureaucracy. Anyone that tried to have a patent introduced or a copyright protected knows how difficult it is. And it is a kind of a vicious circle, because the more bureaucracy there is, the more protection do companies want. If they have to go through all the bureaucratic hurdles, they want to be protected. So this is a circle that creates more and more bureaucracy in order to give more and more IP. Also, IP as it is handled today by the government is full of lobbyism. In every parliament worldwide, there is a series of lobbyists trying to lobby for more and more and more particularistic IP, not in a common sense, but in a particular sense. Also, there is sufficient evidence nowadays that IP leads to anti-competitive behavior and inertia. So there is a real problem, whether you like IP or not, there is a real problem, but there is a way of dealing with it, or at least a promising way, which is not only to accept whatever companies want, especially from a libertarian point of view, Austrian economic point of view, objectivist point of view, and so on. If you accept everything companies want, you allow them to be rent seekers, and we don't want rent seekers, we want entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs negotiate terms of trade, And that is why I say there is hope for IP in a reduced sense to maintain it via contractualism in networks that keep all the dynamism going, whether you call it multi-sided platforms or multi-sided business models. In all those ecosystems of private agents, you have some negotiation of IP, not in the way that Murray Rothbard imagined them, but maybe in a way that might be the middle ground for us and also an innovative middle ground for society and economics at large. Thank you. I wish you still a good free market roadshow.
Thanks to Professor Schneider. It was really inspiring, and he was joining also empirical aspects and theoretical. And finally, I perfectly agree that new waves, collaborative strategies, crowdsourcing, networking, and so on are giving a new light to the problem. And now let me introduce our first panelist, Professor Dusan Popovic from the Faculty of Law. Professor Dusan Popovic is a full professor of intellectual property law, of also the internet law, what is, let's say, very in. He is holding his PhD degree from the University of Paris in Nanterre, also having research fellowships at several universities, in Max Planck Institute, also at the University of Salzburg, and let me mention something personally, also at the University of Skopje from my native town. Now it's time to give a floor to our first panelist, Professor Dusan Popovic.
Thank you, Professor Zaric, and thank you for your kind invitation. It is a pleasure to participate in this panel after such an inspiring keynote address by Professor Schneider. As you said, I'm an IP law professor, so unlike professors of economics, I will not argue in favor of, let's say, total deconstruction of the IP law system, but I would like to emphasize that there are some possibilities within the existing IP law rules. There are some nuances and flexibilities within the system. First of all, in the context of a possible reform of the IP law system, we could address the issue of the duration of rights, which is quite different depending on the type of intellectual property right, and it is quite extreme in the case of trademarks. The second flexibility I see that could be further explored is the area of exceptions and limitations of intellectual property rights. I think that we should make better use of these exceptions and limitations, perhaps introduce new exceptions and limitations which are more adapted to the digital surrounding we are working in for the last 20 years. And we should definitely interpret more extensively the existing limitation of rights. And there is one problem with that, which is a general problem with intellectual property law, and that is that intellectual property rights are national rights. Their validity is territorially limited, and this is in a way an obstacle to the globalized economy. So whatever reform we would like to conduct, we need to take this into consideration and understand that the only good result can come from a global approach. We need to if we are going to reform IP law, we need to reform it globally and not just nationally. And another flexibility I would like to mention does not come directly within the intellectual property law system, but has something to do with it, of course. I'm referring to competition rules. If we analyze case law in United States, in the European Union, we see that there are more and more cases in which competition rules are enforced onto intellectual property owners. So this is a kind of a correctional mechanism. We can sanction an IP law owner, IP right owner that is abusing a dominant position, for instance, and this case law is developing since McGill, IMS Health, Microsoft to this date. For instance, this is not something we are witnessing in Serbia, so I cannot give you an example for this from the case law of the Serbian Competition Authority, but in the context of the EU and the US law, this is quite developed. And finally, there is one flexibility I guess our third panelist is going to mention in further detail, and that is the option for an intellectual property right owner simply not to enforce its IP right in certain cases, and this is possible for instance, copyright owners that decide not to sue for copyright infringement, because basically what the user does increases the popularity of a work and creates generate income in a different manner, or for a patent owner. But I guess my colleague Nikola Ilic will mention this. So to conclude this first interaction, I would like to say that we still have some flexibilities within intellectual property law system that we can explore, and in that manner we can reform the existing IP law rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Popovic. You have brought us now more to the global dimensions of the intellectual property rights, and thank you for your contribution. Now it's the time to give a floor to Professor Mateja Durovic, who is in fact at the moment in Belgrade due to the possibilities to use these, let's say, video links and online lessons, but teaching at King's College, also globetrotting the world. And Professor Durovic is teaching contract law and commercial law. So, Professor Durovic, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Zaric, for this kind introduction. I hope that this technology really works. And also very important, I'm also visiting professor at the Faculty of Economics of the University of Belgrade. I was originally alumni of the Faculty of Law, but now I'm visiting professor, besides being a reader in contract and commercial law at King's College London. Also, I'm a co-director of King's Center for Technology, Ethics, Law and Society. And that's something, that, from that perspective, I really enjoyed following the keynote speech of Professor Schneider, because for me, primarily as someone who is kind of trying to assess the developments of the new technology and what should be the legal and regular response towards the development of the new technology, I think it's very interesting to look at these issues, because at the time we are living in the period of fourth industrial revolution, and the law as such is a very important instrument in this revolution and actually in the period of innovation. And on the one side, law needs to kind of protect some fundamental values and some fundamental principles very important to the society, for example, protection of health. or protection of property. You know, that's something that definitely, like law, still irrespectively of kind of the type of technology used or type of kind of the model which is being used. But on the other side, you know, law has also to be seen an instrument which is not disproportionately inhibiting or like in any other manner kind of slowing down the pace of innovation. And now I really enjoyed listening the keynote speech of Professor Schneider, and you know, like trying to understand, you know, his description of like IP rights as kind of being quite messy, and you know, trying to point out, you know, that you know more money is being invested in innovation in gaming industry than in pharmacy, something you know that is very difficult to hear at any moment, but especially at the moment of currently of the pandemic, ongoing pandemic of Corona-19. And actually, just I checked, and in 2021, basically the gaming industry value is 138 billion American dollars, whereas the value of the pharmaceutical industry is 8 times more than that, which is like 1,170 billion. And it's actually now actually due to COVID, the pharmaceutical industry is still kind of really developing at an incredible pace. So despite, you know, the fact that, you know, maybe more money is being invested in gaming industry, like still the value of the pharmaceutical industry is several times higher. And in that context, it's very interesting, you know, to also look at the question of the IP law and IP rights, and in particular the rules regulating patents, because exactly patents, historically looking, always been intended as something to encourage innovation. And these, you know, patents are always granted for inventions that are new and that are not obvious of previously known technologies, and reward the inventor with a monopoly to prevent others from using these patented inventions for a particular period of time, which is usually up to 20 years. And the premise behind patents is that by providing the monopoly that a patent gives, inventors will be able to reap the reward of their efforts, thereby providing not only an incentive to invent in the first place, but also to invest the sums necessary to produce and market the invention once it is developed, and to share the details of the invention publicly, thereby furthering dissemination of the knowledge. Having said that, you know, the existence of the proper regulation of patents and actually the existence of IP law is in that sense very important from the perspective of the innovation, because, you know, investment, for example, if you talk like the example from pharmaceutical industry, you know, investments will only happen in situations when, you know, the investors know they will get particular right. And if you look, for example, in the case of pharmaceutical industries, the research, you know, to find new medicaments are super expensive, but, you know, production of particular medicament is much cheaper component. So in that sense, it's very important, you know, for the pharmaceutical company to have proper protection of their invention. And driven by its double pattern of dissemination and protection, the mechanism of patents has, you know, without any doubt, constituted a key factor, you know, in the remarkable boom of innovation, you know, that began already with the first industrial revolution. And, you know, during the 20th century, we could witness the development of the large modern companies, you know, that owed much to comparative advantage. And first and foremost, amongst all of them was definitely technology. And the guarantees, you know, that are offered by the patents acted as definitely as incentives to allocate energy, funds, and skilled labor to, you know, something that, you know, has been kind of known since the beginning of the 20th century, like 100 years ago, as research and development. And patents provide a guaranteed return on investment. And, you know, this is very important now, for example, when we talk about pharmaceutical industry that has mentioned, you know, for example, development of a molecule, the level of a medicament is, you know, goes through a process whose time scale is on the order of, you know, several years, you know, 10 years, 20 years, a very long period of time. So in that sense, that's definitely very important to think. And, you know, also, you know, having money as exclusive measure for the innovation, you know, when we talk about that during now the ongoing pandemic of Corona-19, you know, the medicaments are those that kind of save lives of people, and that, you know, kind of cure people. And this is why, it's important to have, kind of strong IP rights in pharmaceutical industry, so that, there is any kind of incentive and there is any kind of economic reasoning of the companies to invest in the companies, to invest in research and to kind of actually make new medicaments that will be actually used for treating and preventing of COVID. So that's what's very, very important. And as I try to point out, making of new medicaments and the research is very expensive, but their production is something much easier. And we can talk maybe about the gaming industry, something being more profitable, but the question is what is more useful for the humankind, what's more useful for the human beings, and whether kind of gaming industries, like what is its aim? Is it as well like pharmaceutical industry to protect human lives? And we should never forget, the pharmaceutical industry based on a strongly protected patents. And also what's very important, that IP rights, which are kind of used in case of gaming industry and pharmaceutical industry, are kind of different. Gaming industry is based on copyright over a software, which is kind of one of weaker forms of legal protection, whereas pharmaceutical industry is based on patents, which is definitely one of the strongest manners to protect innovation. So, definitely, it's difficult to compare these two industries, and that's exactly why I recognize is different form of protection. So that's what's very, very important. So for the time being, what I would like to conclude, it's true that IP rights and IP law may be kind of a bit confusing, messy, and that some undertakings, some enterprises could kind of easily and flexibly operate without this. But generally speaking, IP law in practice does function well, and certain industries like the pharmaceutical ones could hardly exist without them. That is something that's definitely very important to remember. And of course, we can always talk and we can always do research and we can always discuss when it comes to like policy perspectives of IP law and what can kind of be improved and changed. But I would disagree with the idea that current existing IP system of protection, IP law, should be abolished. That's from me for the time being. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Durovic. Thank you for your critical approach. And thank you for your contribution and also bringing us back to the situation of COVID, which for the moment we have a little bit neglected and forgotten, because we are now focused on these topics that are at the moment for us also very, very important and interesting. Now the third panelist is our youngest colleague, Nikola Ilic, who is a lecturer from the Faculty of Law and who has, let's say, been focused in all his, let's say, education to the problems of law and economics, or economics and law. He was also studying at the Faculty of Economics, but also here doing his PhD at the Faculty of Law. And he is also eager or very ready to join associations and to create associations. He is very keen of networking, cooperating, and being active in the associations of law and economics, American Association and Serbian. So let me call Nikola Ilic to give us his considerations. Nikola.
Thank you, Professor, for the kind introduction. I really enjoyed the presentation and also comments and points made by the other speakers. I think they already covered very well all important issues related to this topic, and I will try to contribute a little bit to this interesting discussion by making two additional observations. I would start with the first slide, basically, and the starting assumption that we saw, stating that we have more investments in video games than in research and development of a new medicine. In general, I would be cautious when making such a conclusion because these are two different industries and two different types of investments. There are many differences between these two types of investments, and I would mention only a few of them. For example, if you invest in video games, the relevant market is worldwide. Basically, anyone could play a video game, from children to older people, anyone in the world. So it's a huge market and a huge demand. On the other side, when investing in research and development of a new medicine, you have a specific target group to say, and demand is not so significant. So it's a huge difference. The second difference between these two types of investment is if you invest in a video game, you could easily access any national market in the world. You can sell a video game online. Basically, you don't have a huge or high barriers to entry any national market. On the other side, if you invest in research and development of a new medicine, it's really hard to enter different national markets. There are high barriers to entry. You have to comply with different regulation, to pay fees and taxes and so on and so on. So extremely high barriers to entry, and that's also a significant difference. In the third place, I would mention sunk costs. For example, if you invest in a video game and it turns out it's a failure, it's not a big deal. That is to say, it's not a huge sunk cost. You could use the same code of a video game to develop something else, or even if you abandon the project, it's not a huge sunk cost. On the other side, if you invest in research and development of a new medicine and it turns out it's a failure, usually it's a huge sunk cost because you had to pay a lot of people, highly qualified people, you had to invest in expensive equipment and so on. So there are also many other differences between these two types of investments, but I believe it's enough to mention just these three to conclude that basically we have different types of investments and different industries, and we should not blame IP rights because we have more investments in video games than in research and development of a medicine. As my colleague Mateja says, basically when it comes to COVID, it's a worldwide disease. So once again, we have a huge market, huge demand, and suddenly we have investments, a lot of investments in that field. So for me, in my opinion, I would be cautious when making the conclusion that we have more investments in video games than in research and development of a new medicine due to IP rights. And because that starting assumption is a little bit problematic, I would be cautious when deriving all other conclusions from that starting assumption. And also, I would like to use one additional minute to make a few comments on one slide that was the most interesting for me, and that's the very last slide. If you remember, that's the yellow flag with a rattlesnake. That flag was designed in 1775 by military commander and politician Christopher Gadsden. It's a Gadsden flag, and if you take a closer look, you'll see at the tail of the snake 13 lines representing 13 states in the America at that time, fighting for independence against UK. And the message was quite clear: don't tread on me, or we don't want to be your colony, we want to be independent, we want to be free. And the message is clear. But still, that does not imply that they wanted to create a chaos. On the contrary, they wanted to create a better system than the one that existed in the UK. And they did that. And the very same man, Christopher Gadsden, was working on the first draft of the American Constitution, and he recognized the importance of IP rights for further development and for functioning of the free market. And you could find many authors, including Zorina Khan and her recent book, Inventing Ideas, basically claiming that the states were and still are so successful because they were first in the world to establish such a system to protect IP rights. And in that sense, I would say that IP rights are not an obstacle for functioning of the free market, but on the contrary, they are a precondition for better functioning of the free market because they enable commodification and optimal allocation of resources, and if you want so, they enable increase in social welfare. So I think that idea behind that flag was not we want to abolish IP rights and we want to abolish this system, but rather we want to improve this system and to make it better. In that sense, I would agree with the keynote speaker. Yes, we have shortcomings, we have failures of the system, we have problems, and we should find ways how to handle that, how to solve these problems. But that does not mean that we should abolish IP rights. To put it simple, I think, in my opinion, we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Thanks, everybody. We are now running out of time. And thanks to our keynote speaker, Professor Henrique Schneider. Thanks to all of you, dear panelists. Thanks to the audience. And now it's a time to close with announcing the next Free Market Roadshow, which would be held 20th of April, the same time, 5 p.m. We can follow the discussion on monetary policy, and a keynote would be Leszek Balcerowicz. Most of you know the works of Professor Leszek Balcerowicz, who has been also serving as a Vice Prime Minister of the Republic of Poland and who is one of the guru of transition studies at all, and whose works are very, let's say, very known in the scholarly literature and in academic life. So also the monetary policy in the COVID time is giving us a lot of, let's say, original, but also measures which could be a matter of discussion, of, let's say, sharply different positions about that. So I am kindly inviting you to join our next Free Market Roadshow, 20th of April, 5 p.m. in Zurich. So thanks to all. Goodbye, auf Wiedersehen, and stay healthy and safe. Thank you very much for participating.